All right, I think everyone is back. So also from my side, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Uli Brueckner. I am here the academic director of the ICD, and in my other life, I'm a Jean Monnet professor for European Studies at Stanford University, where I will also spend the second half of this year on the home campus in California. But I'm happy that at the moment I got the chance to be here to work with you in this symposium, in which I will be today the only member of academia, while we had a former ambassador and we will have more ambassadors to come, which does not make much of a difference because Karl-Erik can have multiple identities as a former diplomat and a professor at the Academy of the ICD. But I will try to get your attention to see that things might be different depending on where we come from and what kind of professional identity we will develop. And what professors or members of academia normally do is that we try to explain everything or to question everything. And so when we come together here as a symposium, the main thing is to start with what we actually do here. So on the one hand, we can get you in touch with interesting people, like we did yesterday on the occasion of the WDR Europa Forum, where you had the highest possible concentration of important political personnel of the European Union, and they do something, talk about politics, diplomacy, European affairs, and so on. And the next day, other people with ties and positions and titles do the same, but actually it's different. Because what they did yesterday on the occasion of the Europa Forum was, in my understanding, something like a secular religious celebration that a group of believers gather to reassure each other that what they believe in is true. And then they invite a sinner, like the foreign minister of Slovakia, and grill him and make him feel like he's a deviation from the norm. The norm is what we represent here, and we have some core beliefs, and we repeat this over and over again from different angles, and make everyone feel good that we believe in the right thing. And the deviation from the norm is not so right, but it's good to sometimes remind people that there is a threat that things could get out of control and move in the wrong direction. So if you look at it from this perspective, that it was something like Easter or Pentecost for the European integration movement, things instantly get a different meaning. It was not so much about explaining stuff, but it was about gathering for the sake of reassuring that we are the right ones, we are the good ones, we know how things function. While what we do here in academia is to question all this, which does not necessarily mean that we have different beliefs. As a person, I have a multiple identity, and I'm also German and formatted by everything Karl-Erik explained to us. But as a member of academia, I should ask myself what is happening there and try to deconstruct an orchestrated event like yesterday, where we had light and music and the introduction of important people and red carpets and all the things that from a ceremonial point of view belong to our perspective of using cultural elements to explain what is going on and not like everything taken as face value and taking things for granted. So when I come here, I sometimes have a mild schizophrenic feeling, because on the one hand, the ICD started as an NGO, and as an NGO, it became very successful in using cultural diplomacy, the combination of the two words, as a sales strategy to attract your attention and to make you come from all over the world to learn something about two very attractive terms. Culture is sexy, we all find cultural things interesting, and diplomacy sounds so important, people in dark suits and mannered and educated, and the combination of the two is even more attractive because it's not only about stimulating trade and make people sign trade deals, or even ugly stuff like TTIP that could ruin our beautiful cultures by exposing it to more globalization and so on. So this is not what people like to do, can also be super dry, but it's the interesting part of diplomacy and exchanging, and then we learn from other cultures and so on and so forth. So this is so broad and so diverse, and I think Karl-Erik gave a perfect example of, even if we look at a single example like Germany, things can be super diverse and rich, and there's a time aspect, and there is a high and low culture aspect, and then we could even include things like cuisine and dress codes and whatever, and it's endless. So that allows the ICD to basically use any possible example as an example of cultural diplomacy, and it's so interesting that we can make projects on football as cultural diplomacy and food as cultural diplomacy and dance and music and so on. So everyone can find something interesting for him and her. And as great as it is to be so multidimensional and so full of different access points, it's the worst for academia if we have to be very precise and very clear in what exactly are we talking about when we discuss cultural diplomacy. Because if we try not only to describe things, but to explain something, then an explanation has to have a clear-cut definition. And if we don't define it, anything goes. And as nice as it is to have anything going, because it also is very important when we work in academia to understand what we are talking about. And that is exactly what Karl-Erik tried to get across, that if we are not natural-born Germans and spend our lives in this country, then we don't know much about the things he introduced to you. So there are long lists of composers and artists and cultural diplomats in the one way or the other, which gives you, when you hear about it, the impression that this country is so rich and diverse, which it probably is. But my guess is one could do the same for every country, and depending on how much we go into detail, you could even do it for a region or a city or a village, in which then the cultural differences between the upper village and the lower village could also go into, and then there was this guy who invented this pattern in how he made a pullover, as we heard yesterday, as a metaphor for European integration. Even Merkel was confronted with this metaphor that Juncker coined in the conversation. So it doesn't say much if we have a name-dropping list of these people represent culture and it's so rich and so diverse. Because this is what we often find in Wikipedia entries, like all you need to know about something. And this is good to know because we need the empirical knowledge to get started. But after knowing what's out there, we should move on in academia and try to explain something. And for the sake of explaining things, we have these colliding worlds under the roof of the ICD, that the NGO is accessible for everything, and it can't be too broad because everything has a cultural dimension. And in the academic side, if we don't have a definition, we cannot use cultural diplomacy to explain a thing. And then everything is only implicit. For example, when Karl-Erik showed a map of Europe and Germany was in the middle, in the way the person who drew the map made Germany be in the middle, because you can also make other maps and then Germany is at the corner and you have the Ural Mountains in the middle. He said, this shows what Germany's role is. And of course you can decode this and say, aha, it's central, and if it's central, it spreads out and it influences the others. But if we draw another map, like a global map, then Germany is so tiny that everyone would think, now I know what Germany's role is, because it's totally irrelevant. It's so little, and it's also aging and shrinking, and then there are other emerging powers, that the conclusion from another map is, this is an irrelevant country, and you better come now, because in a few years from now, it will be so irrelevant that it would be a waste of time to come here to visit. So depending on what we suggest, people have different associations, as long as we don't define what exactly are we saying if we use cultural diplomacy as an explanatory instrument to explain something? And this is what I'm trying to do in the next minutes, because we have more ambassadors to come and one shouldn't let ambassadors wait. And here's what my assistant thought I should use as a visualization of what we do. She thought, you should talk about trains, because we are not statist in what we do, and train is a perfect example of moving on, and it's about transition, and Karl-Erik talked about the crossroads that we are at the moment. So these are the 4 steps that I will address in the coming minutes, that after reflecting on my problem with cultural diplomacy as not only its multiple dimensions, but also to explain something, I was asked to talk about Europe in crisis, which is also a follow-up to what you experienced yesterday at the Foreign Office, and highlight 4. And with these 4 crises, I use cultural diplomacy as a lens to look at what's going on with these 4 crises and ask myself, and invite you to join me, to look at what cultural diplomacy could do to help to fix the problem. And in that way of trying to explain something, I go beyond to say, well, we also have something to do with each other, and culture matters, and more the storytelling part of it. But this is also a problem for the overestimation of cultural diplomacy, or its inherent problem with the commitment of the ICD to promote cultural diplomacy, because in the way our website presents it, makes everyone feel as if it's a good thing per se, as if it has no costs. But as we know from personal experience, everything has costs. Even the fact that you sit here and listen to me comes with a price tag, which is you cannot enjoy the beautiful day out there because you sit in a room and it's getting warm, and some of you are even so bored that they need to use their smartphones to get additional information, because it's not enough to listen to a professor who came specifically to inform you about something, but we are all multitaskers, and some could even have a headset to listen to other stuff while the professor is making sound in front of you, as if I am a TV set, which one can turn off and on as you wish, which is also a cultural question of manners. Do you pay full attention, or do you sort of divide your attention to other things as well? So, starting with the problems. This is not Europe, this is probably the United States, like a wide country, and we don't know where we are heading to. The first task I was asked to talk about is the upcoming problem of Brexit. So we brand things. The media have it easier if everyone understands under a certain logo or a certain name a complex problem, and Brexit means the exit of Britain from the European Union, which in a nutshell is a cold-blooded calculation of costs and benefits of a member state of the European Union to discuss whether it's still in the interest of a sovereign state to stay in a self-binding commitment club called the European Union, or whether it's better to live alone and to enjoy splendid isolation and autonomy. So this is the calculation, and the citizens in a democracy in Britain have to decide whether they go for the one line of argumentation or the other. Problem. Number 2, financial crisis. The European Union started as a market, it moved on, we reached the point of a monetary union, which is not trivial because money isn't neutral, and the fact that we are now in the same boat with one money in 19 of 28 member states and more to come, because they signed a commitment that once they meet the criteria, they introduce a common currency, makes this a community of fate in which the exit costs coming back to Britain could become prohibitively expensive. Even if you think there are a number of good reasons to leave, it might be a mild form of a suicidal tendency. If you do this to your economy, then you might be confronted with unintended consequences that go beyond the imagination of people who would happily live in splendid isolation. So what it is, in a nutshell, when I try to be as oversimplifying as in the case of Brexit, it is a situation of structural imbalances that could be addressed by a new form of governance, and it brings up the question of solidarity. If we have a major imbalance between countries that are doing well right now, as Germany, and other countries that are under observation whether they do macroeconomically the right thing, and they are told what the right thing is by others, then this causes an autonomy problem, and it causes a legitimacy problem, and it brings up the question of, if the EU is more than a club of utility maximizers, what are the shared principles, the values, the ideals, the cultural glue that holds everything together, and how do we define solidarity if this is not only a lip service but something everyone feels committed to in a club that also then means solidarity in terms of redistribution of money. Which leads me to the third major crisis, which is the refugee crisis, which is a terrible word because it makes people in need part of a problem, and that creates even worse terms like we are flooded or it's a tsunami or other absurdities in which we use people in comparison with a natural catastrophe, which is absolutely unacceptable and absurd. But in the branding part of what it is, we have refugee crisis as established as Brexit or the financial crisis, and which one can also discuss whether it's a financial crisis or a euro crisis or a monetary union crisis. So the lack of precision is a problem here, but in the name of the sales strategy of do we know what we are talking about, one can understand why it was called a refugee crisis. So as simple as I defined the previous crisis, the refugee crisis is just a quantity problem, first of all, because at times when refugees come in small numbers, we didn't even talk about it and simply integrated them or processed the problem in a bureaucratic manner, and then they got the status or they didn't, but it wasn't much of a deal. The moment we reach numbers like over 1 million refugees coming in a short period of time to Germany, it is something that shakes the country. Like what you said about Mutti and the rising opposition and new populist forces that have never been loud in this country. Of course, they existed on the edges, left edge, right edge of the political spectrum. This is now the fuel for a changing political balance that could turn Germany into something different, and not only Germany, but all the other countries that respond in very different ways. Sweden differently from what you heard yesterday from the foreign minister of Slovakia. And if this is not something that is just an exogenous shock that enters Europe by people coming in large numbers, but when we look at the root causes, it instantly changes the perspective of this navel glazing. We have an internal problem that someone's going to leave. We have a structural imbalance in the way we organize a monetary union. We have people to come here and they bring their cultures and we don't know if we can integrate them or what the level of integration actually is that we define as a must. Like all these related inward-looking questions also have an external dimension. And this external dimension brings up the question whether the European Union can act as a normative actor if they believe that what they stand for is not only good for the lucky ones who have been born here and have the full status as EU citizens, but if we believe that these are universal values that we stand for, do we have a moral obligation to promote these values outside of the territory that currently counts as the European Union? Which brings up the question of what's the state of EU foreign policy, and do we have a responsibility to intervene, which is also a question on a United Nations level as an obligation, which our friend from Scotland is teaching in various universities and I guess also at the ICD. So there are a number of aspects that go beyond this inward-looking dimension of European integration that has been subject to the secular religious gathering that you attended yesterday. So when we then move on from the description, like this is not a complete story of the crisis, but my 4 cases to look at. Then we go back to my reminder that we can also only think of cultural diplomacy as an instrument to explain something if we first explain what we are talking about. And when you visit the website of the ICD, it doesn't help you much, because here the definition of cultural diplomacy is anything, like norms and values and changing patterns and interaction and tralala. So it's as open as the NGO needs it to be to explain why we have sports events and dance events and meeting with ambassadors events and so on. But for the academic purpose, it's too broad. If everything is cultural diplomacy, then we cannot explain anything, because if everything goes, you can never test the counterexample. So what I highlight here is rather the aim of cultural diplomacy, and this is also the mission statement on the website of the ICD, that it's about strengthening mutual understanding. I leave it like this, plus moderating conflicting interests. Also fair enough. And finally, raising awareness and changing perspectives of people coming from homogeneous societies. That was more a reference to our friends from Slovakia and Poland and Hungary, who were represented yesterday only by one, because the Polish minister felt so exposed that he didn't even feel like sending a video message, because he didn't want to disturb the religious movement by saying something incorrect, which is basically the opposite of what we are committed to, because we provide a stage to give people a chance to interact and to understand that there are always more versions than the one that has been represented yesterday in the Foreign Office as the true and the real one, how one should look at European integration. Which also brings up the question of, if this is the purpose of this definition of what should be applied as cultural diplomacy, who are the actors? Which also needs to be defined, because it can also be anyone. But if we normally talk about diplomacy, then we talk about people like Karl-Erik at the time when he officially represented Sweden, and he had the official role, and what he said was the official position of the government in power at the time. And if the government changes, he, as the speaker of Sweden in the embassy, would say the opposite, because this government make him say the opposite, because he's the voice of Sweden in another country in this official form of diplomacy and an exchange of communication on a state level, intergovernmental. But what we saw yesterday in the Foreign Office was also a perfect example, and the fact that Karl-Erik highlighted all the private and non-state forms of cultural diplomacy highlighted it again, that we live in the 21st century in which there is no such thing like an exclusive role of the voice of Sweden or the voice of Germany to send out a message, but we are all ambassadors. And you are a container of your culture, and you bring it here, and by the interpersonal communication, you become a different person, and you want to become one, because that's why you come all the way to Berlin, to the ICD, because this is what we call education. You change, you widen your horizon, and you inspire yourself by what you hear from representatives of other cultures and become a different person. And by becoming a different person, you also change your culture, because when you go back or elsewhere, then you expose what you learned to the other people and might inspire them by what you learned in Germany from a Swedish ambassador or all the other people who actively participate in our projects to make the world a better place here. So in this perspective of governance in the 21st century is no longer intergovernmental, but it also sees an important role of civil society. The ICD is a diplomatic institution and does not only use the term in its branding, like what we stand for and how we sell our different products and invitations, but it is also something that describes a changing world in which we all act cross-border to promote something. Whether the intention is a positive one in the sense of strengthening mutual understanding or not remains an another question, because of course I could also use propaganda, as you showed in the Goebbels case. The intention is independent from the tool. The tool is what we have at hand, but what we do with it is not yet defined in normative standards, as if we use a hammer and say, I can fix a problem with a hammer and get a nail in the wall, or I can torture you. And then it's not the problem of the hammer, but it's what we make with the tool. So the fact that we have cultural diplomacy instruments or we have culture doesn't automatically mean that we make the world a better place. And the fact that we use it cross-border doesn't automatically mean that the result is a better one. Because if we manipulate people's opinion, or if we cut people off from access to other forms of a creation of reality, can trigger a conflict. Because if, take yesterday's gathering, if we believe that this is the only way one should look at European integration, then we exclude others and put them in a defensive position, as the poor Slovak foreign minister who had to defend himself and didn't really succeed, although he got half an hour to get his position clear and he didn't use it. And then in the end, we have the feeling that he's wrong because he didn't have much to offer as an alternative to this love, peace, and happiness and ever closer union concept that was represented by the good Europeans that gathered and were reminded by Steinmeier, our foreign minister, that we should wear blue ties, because if we would even wear European ties, then as the doorman of the foreign ministry in Chisinau, that he couldn't pronounce right, but he lectured us that there is a government, that there is a capital in a country in Europe, the Republic of Moldau, which has doormans who wear European Union ties, and we should all do this to show our commitment also by the way of how we wear a flag. I was rather tempted to wear, because I knew that Esteban comes from a different angle, wearing my Bayern München identity, because I'm a proud member of the team. We have a club, and the owners of the club are people like me, and not like oligarchs, as in Britain, like Abramovich, who owns Chelsea, but we own our club. And this is another form of my identity, but I thought this goes too far as a statement of cultural diplomacy if I bring in football and you wanted me to speak as a member of academia about the things we do here. So when we now apply it, like if this is all the purpose and these are all the constraints that we have to keep in mind, then we can see that in the case of Brexit, the absence of cultural diplomacy would immediately cause a drama, because Britain is an island and they have a very islandish, self-reflective discourse on Brexit. And Juncker sat on his chair yesterday, the president of the European Commission, and when he was asked why he's not active in the campaign to communicate with Britain, he says, I'm not Obama, and I wouldn't win a popularity contest, so it's even better not to go there, because that would instantly be instrumentalized in the no campaign, and so he rather stays on continental Europe and doesn't disturb them in their self-reflection on is it a good thing or a bad thing. But the greatest cultural achievement of European integration stems from the fact that we developed an institutional architecture to moderate conflicts of interests coming from the fact that we represent different cultures. So it's not like one melting pot where everyone is obliged to do the same thing, wear the same clothes, think the same way, believe in the same stereotypical ideas of what Europe is or what it should be, but it's an invitation to fight in a constructive way and not fighting on battlegrounds. We don't go to war anymore. As you heard, we are such a peaceful country. We rather go to committees, which is super boring, super dry, not sexy, doesn't make it to the media, and rather creates a bureaucratic stereotype of how boring and how much of a waterhead the European Union is, but it functions. It cuts down complex problems of that size to things that can be managed in a bureaucratic way by cutting it into pieces and make it a piece of legislation and a package deal and all the things in which we address problems in a cultivated way with institutions. And the moment the United Kingdom would be gone, we would be exposed to no such thing like an institutional architecture to channel conflicts, and we would simply go back to realpolitik as some sort of an open clash of conflicting interests, not even moderated in an exchange of ideas, because they are cut off from our ideas and we are cut off from their ideas, and it all depends on us, the civil society, to inform others about what else is going on in our various discourses. And people like Wolfgang Tillmans, who is a Dresden-born photographer who now has 2 studios in Berlin and in London, is starting his own private stay in the European Union campaign, and we should love the European Union, which is kind of difficult to give your heart to an abstract apparatus like a supranational organization. But he, as an artist, believes that this is his obligation as a citizen to do this. If governments fail to communicate, and Juncker even stays at home, I don't want to say anything because they don't like me anyway, and not having an open, interactive form of, I have something to offer, it's attractive, listen to me, even this is not going to work. So cultural diplomacy, application, if it's about promoting intercultural communication and a better understanding, it's a must. If we don't have it, and there is no institutional architecture, we will be in deep trouble. Probably Britain more than we are, but it's evident. Second example, financial crisis. It looks very technical and it looks very much like macroeconomics, but at the end of the day, it's about trust. We don't trust banks anymore. Banks don't trust each other. We don't trust lenders. We don't trust the ability of Syriza to implement an austerity package. If we don't restore trust, the whole thing is going down the drain. And even if we have an institutional architecture at work, which we do, other than in the Brexit case where they voluntarily leave the membership of the different institutions where their voice will be heard, the whole thing will be in ruin, because then the law will be law in the books and people don't believe in it. And the only way to restore it is cultural exchange, mutual understanding. So although this is not sufficient, it's necessary to get anything done. And if we don't focus more on this and rather project our stereotypes on Germany is this and Greece is that, it will never lead to anything like a successful solution, not to speak of its lack of sustainability. Third one, refugees. We talked about solidarity in the case of the financial crisis. How much is Germany willing, or shall we organize a transfer system? This is solidarity in terms of money. But solidarity can also have different currencies, like the Baltic states are afraid of Russia, and their understanding of solidarity is, can you send us troops? Can you expand the NATO security umbrella, that Russia is impressed that American forces come closer to their borders and they rather don't play the same hybrid warfare game as they played in Crimea, where they did not openly intervene as Russian troops, but use cultural diplomacy, propaganda, orchestrating an uprise of something like a civil movement, and then the civil movement leads to a referendum, and the referendum sounds like perfectly legitimate, and then you have all the trolls in the internet that explain that our narrative is worse than theirs, and so you create a new reality, and the new reality is as powerful as what Karl Erich described as the positive reality of a perception of Germany that sort of naturally grew without having one orchestrating super office to control what kind of narrative is in the best interest of an autocratic regime. So in that perspective, solidarity can be exchanged in terms of money, in terms of burden sharing. How many refugees are you willing to take to ease the burden on border countries like Italy or Greece, or Sweden that is willing to take more per capita than any other country in the European Union? And isn't that also part of our commitment to shared values and principles? But there's another dimension of solidarity, and this form of solidarity is to pool resources and trust each other in speaking with one voice and giving up a certain amount of what you consider to be your autonomy and your sovereignty in your belief that speaking with one voice could also be in your interest that goes beyond what you could do alone. So another map example, when we look at a world map, and none of us in Europe would be someone to talk with in trade relations with the United States, but they do talk with us if we get our act together and speak with one voice. That's the big difference between trade, where we get our act together and we are a homogeneous actor and we are a larger economy than the United States, while when it comes to foreign policy and defense, we do not. And that leads to a situation that we are an economic heavyweight, but politically we are fragmented, and we shouldn't be fragmented because all the root causes of the refugee crisis and partly also of the other crises that I mentioned are not lying in Europe, but they are part of a process that can be described as globalization, another buzzword as cultural diplomacy that needs to be defined more precisely, but everyone has an association when I introduce a word like this, which means that it doesn't help if we build an island of the happy and stable and provide peace, stability, and prosperity for the ins, but we also should think about what's happening around us and not only in our direct neighbors, what Steinmeier yesterday called the ring of fire, but also what needs to be addressed as a representative of Europe as a normative actor. So when we come then to conclusions, then you will see that in all these cases, cultural diplomacy can make a difference if we apply it on what the purpose is and look into the different means, but it is never sufficient. So this idealistic idea of if we only do enough with culture, then the world will be a better place is not only naive, it's also misleading, because this indifference of tools, whether you use it for a good purpose or a bad purpose, again needs a definition of what is the normative standard you apply and what is defined as good and bad. Look at the poor Slovak foreign minister yesterday. His understanding of good and bad was very different from what everyone else said in this secular religious gathering. So as long as we don't understand where we come from and what our norms are and why we define it like this, then we don't even understand that there are conflicting narratives, which is a major problem in Russia at the moment, where people are simply cut off from other interpretations of what the geopolitical situation is. But there is a tendency, wherever we are, to rather go with the mainstream and to believe that as long as we are mainstream, everything else is less legitimate, which is partly the problem in Germany right now with what you mentioned as the AfD phenomenon, that all the established parties shared their belief that European integration is a good thing, that there was no one to elect in a pluralist discourse or in elections. And when populists identify that there is a blank spot and one can occupy this space with everyone who is dissatisfied with the results of European integration or globalization, then they entered the scene and challenged the kind of lazy mainstream parties that are now trying harder to convince the public that what they stand for is the better version than a nationalist, populist, overly simplifying alternative, even if they call themselves an alternative. So I leave it here and hope that you understand that my message was not only to describe what is currently happening in Europe, but trying to develop an instrument to explain how things can be changed, and not only complain that things are so bad and it has been better in the past and who knows and we are at crossroads or what else you got yesterday in the conference. But their mission was, as I said in the beginning, not so much to explain things, but rather to gather and unite under one overarching theme is European integration is a good thing, which I also personally believe, but as a member of academia, I should question this as I question what we do at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. On this not perfectly happy, but mixed note, thank you very much for your attention. And